that was more oil than was produced all over the rest of the whole world.
Yeah.
And this is just one well in East Texas. This is before the discovery of West Texas, before Oklahoma, before the California fields were discovered, before the Alaskan fields were discovered.
Yeah.
So America, in the year 1901, was the principal supplier of oil, the principal source of oil. We were energy independent, doesn't begin to cover it. We were oil.
We were it, yeah.
We were it. Now, in 1911, Winston Churchill, who was at that time the first Lord of the Admiralty, discovered that it was more efficient and with perhaps war on the horizon would be better to convert the fleet to oil. And so he made a presentation to the Parliament to convert the fleet. Oil-fired ships could go faster and fuel faster, and there were many good reasons to do it. Now, there was a proposal from Royal Dutch Shell. Royal Dutch was a fusion of the Shell Trading Company, which was founded by a man named Marcus Samuel, and the Royal Dutch National Company. Their proposal was also compared to one by a small company called Anglo-Persian, which was on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, the Parliament debated all night, and it's not clear what their concerns were, but apparently they had reservations about a company that was partly foreign-owned and partly Jewish-owned. And they chose to put their money into Anglo-Persian to rebuild Anglo-Persian, holding a significant ownership position. Anglo-Persian became British Petroleum.
Ah, okay.
Not to worry about Royal Dutch, they went to explore in Iraq.
I see, okay.
So
they weren't lacking.
They weren't lacking. They weren't left lacking. So you can see how the U.S. dominance in petroleum led to the development of the 20th century. It led to a society based on automobiles. It led to urban sprawl. It led to large distance transportation. No one worried much about driving long distances.
Yes. We have like a lot of oil here in the United States. Why don't we use it? Why have we shifted our resources to the Middle East? Like, what exactly is oil, and how is it used here in the United States?
Well, let me tell you what the use patterns are, and then let me come back to the issue of why we have a foreign, how we got from the biggest producer in the world. We're still, as a matter of fact, the third largest producer in the world, but we have probably the single largest appetite in the world.
Yeah, and a great dependency.
And our industry and our transportation systems are all built on it.
Yes.
Have been built on it. Look, our oil built our industry. Our industry and our fuel won World War II.
Yep.
It's an integral part of America. It's an integral part of who we are and how we think. We use, you asked me how the use patterns, let me mention that. About 45% of the barrel of petroleum goes to motor gasoline. And about another 15% goes to diesel fuels, trucks, railroads. About 10% to the chemical industry for feedstock, about 10% to the airlines, and that leaves about 20% for residential, commercial heating and some industrial lubrication, industrial uses.
Okay.
So for purposes of our discussion, more than half is going into transportation.
Okay.
And that becomes very important when we talk about efficiency, transportation efficiency.
Right.
Okay. Now, the question that you began to ask is how did we get from so completely sufficient to a net importer?
Yes.
Okay. There was a man in the 1950s by the name of M. King Hubbard. King Hubbard was a geologist, and he worked for the Shell Oil Company. He had a theory, and in the 1950s, oil was growing in this country at the rate of about 7% per year. It just, production and need to use it was growing.
That was the big Texas,
It was-
Oklahoma
it-
oil well times.
It was that's right. It was the era of big oil.
The Beverly Hillbillies.
Right. Now, King Hubbard's theory was fairly straightforward, and let me see if I can give you
Okay.
an analogy that makes sense. If I were to tell you that there's a certain field, it's maybe an acre of land,
Yes.
and I've planted diamonds in that field, some big, some small.
Yes.
Not an infinite number, a finite number. And you're free to look for them and find them and live on them. You sell them when you find them. Now you might find that at first it's pretty easy to find diamonds and you're finding some nice big ones. And after a while it gets a little harder to find. And pretty soon you're not even finding enough to keep up with your household needs. Well, Hubbard said mathematically that I can take a look at how difficult it is to find and how much I've found already, and I can predict when there will be a peak, when I won't, not that I won't find any more, but that I won't be able to sustain the rate at which I'm finding.
Okay.
He did that calculation. And admittedly, he did it for the United States, which was very heavily explored at the time and very well understood and very well documented. But his prediction was, and this was about 1955, that by 1970, or thereabouts, the U.S. production rate of petroleum would reach a peak and would go into decline, an irreversible decline. Now, we reached that peak somewhere between 1970 and 1972 at about 10 million barrels a day. And our production right now is about 6 million barrels a day. Our demand continued to grow. And we use close to 20 million barrels a day. That means we import 14 million barrels a day. Now, I think it's interesting to note two things. One is that Jimmy Carter was in office when this happened.
Yes.
And he said, this is the moral equivalent of war. We have to do something. We have to harness our energies just the way we would if we were in a war. And we have to find technologies which are adaptable. And he was particularly interested, in those days the Department of Energy was particularly interested in coal because the technology for conversion of coal to motor gasoline existed and was known. Demonstration plants were built. I remember visiting them. I remember working on committees to help with research needs at that time.
Is that in Seattle, out in Seattle?
I visited one in Seattle, but there were several built throughout the country. What happened was that Mr. Carter wasn't reelected in 1980.
Yeah.
And Mr. Reagan said, with some justification, I mean, in retrospect we can be critical, but with some real justification, he said, look, why should we pay $30 a barrel for synthetic petroleum when we can buy it for $20 a barrel in the world market? And the demonstration plants were shut down, research was shut down, a lot of good people working on conversion of natural resources, generally speaking, North American hydrocarbons, to liquid fuels, went to find other work.
Yeah.
And in fact, the argument was valid. By 1986, there was a glut, and oil was selling at $10 a barrel. But implicit in the bargain was that we were not going to be independent. We were going to be global, not domestically independent. And we might perhaps have to use our armed forces from time to time to defend our lines of communication to the oil fields.
Like we did in Kuwait.
Like we did in 1991 in Kuwait. And like some people argue, did again in this last war.
Current war, yeah.
Okay. So I think you can see that, well, I guess I should add in passing, people were so impressed with Hubbard's work in the United States that they set up institutes to look at the entire world. And they've published some material on this subject, and the consensus seems to be that we're right about the top. We're near the top right now.
You're talking about in the
worldwide, 80 million barrels a day, close to what we're producing right now, is about the maximum. And that we will go into decline. Whether we go into decline in 2007 or 2010, but we're close to going into decline.